This is Jenny Kunkel, and in this video we are going to look at Chapter 1, start our discussion on the introduction to web development by looking at web application architecture and an introduction to JavaScript. We will use slides from the textbook to facilitate this discussion. You can go ahead and access Eagle, go to the Module 1 roadmap, and download the slides from the reading materials section of the page. In this first chapter, we will embark on a journey to explore the fundamental concepts that make web applications dynamic and interactive. JavaScript has become the backbone of modern web development, enabling developers to create rich user experiences that engage and captivate users. As we delve into this topic, we will uncover the essential components of web applications, including client-side and server-side scripting and how they work together to deliver seamless functionality. Get ready to discover how JavaScript transforms static web pages into vibrant applications that respond to user interactions in real time. We want to first look at a web application that consists of a web server, a network, and clients. In this case, a client such as a computer tablet or a smartphone uses a web browser to access a web server that is associated to a website across the network. In this particular illustration, it is indicating that this network is the internet. The web browser will request pages from the web server that are accessible by the internet, will process the requests, and return each request's response to render in the browser. If we think of the internet in the most general terms, it is essentially a network of networks. The two types of networks that the textbook focuses on with web applications are local area networks and wide area networks. The difference between these network types is based on the geographic area that each covers. A local area network, or LAN, covers a small distance and generally would connect computers within the same building. A wide area network, or WAN, covers a larger geographic area and essentially connects different local area networks using a router to route network traffic. An internet service provider, or ISP, is a company that has a WAN that is connected to the internet. In most cases, companies, schools, etc., will lease a connection in a WAN that is connected to the internet from an ISP to allow their networks to be connected to the internet. However, it is also possible for an organization to own its own private WAN that would be connected to the internet, but this is going to be less common due to the associated cost and maintenance requirements. To recap, this illustration depicts a web application which is accessible via the internet. However, web applications can also be made available via an intranet on either a local area network or a wide area network that would not be directly accessible through the internet. Most generally, you'll find that companies will have some type of intranet applications that address internal needs, such as maybe a web application for looking up employee benefits information, or maybe something for detailing an employee handbook, those types of things. Thus, we cannot assume that the web applications that are developed will always be available from the internet, since it is possible to write internal applications as well that would be hosted on an intranet. As with anything computer related, there's a protocol that is going to be used for making the request. A web browser makes a request to a web server either using the HTTP or HTTPS protocol. Here, HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and HTTPS stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure. When using HTTPS as a protocol, the request is encrypted over a secure communication channel that is generally referred to as a secure tunnel. For our class purposes, however, we will only be using the HTTP protocol since we're not going to deal with the hassles of installing certificates to handle the HTTPS protocol. However, it should be noted that any web application that is run on the intranet or internet should use the HTTPS protocol to address any of the security-related concerns that are out there on the web today. Here, the browser makes a request, essentially sending a uniform resource locator or URL that refers to a specific HTML page on a web server. The web server locates that static web page sitting on the web server. This web page is written in HTML or hypertext markup language to define the static content. This page could contain some cascading style sheets as well, because that doesn't necessarily mean that the web page is dynamic. The page is considered static because the HTML and CSS that are served up as a response remains the same no matter how many times the site is accessed. The content does not change, and there is no client-side interactivity. In this instance, they are just indicating that this is being done with HTML. The web server processes the request and returns the page as part of the HTTP response back to the browser. The browser is going to take the returned HTML from the response or that static web page and then render that in the browser. For a dynamic web page, it is showing us that we still have a request being made to the web server, similar to what we saw for the static page. But this time, instead of just rendering an HTML file that is sitting on the web server, it is showing us that it's passing control over to run the request on the application server. The application server will run the associated script, which will then reach out to get any necessary data that is stored in a database system on a database server. This response to the script will dynamically generate HTML with the information returned from the database real-time and could potentially change from request to request. If we think about what happens to an online store with their Black Friday specials, inventory levels are going to change for a product. I may be able to purchase a product because it is still available, but at some point a consumer will attempt to buy a product which is no longer available and will get some type of messaging on the web page that indicates that the product is no longer available to purchase. Because of the dynamic nature of the web page at runtime based on the script results, we refer to this as server-side processing, which means that the page content gets finalized and rendered by the browser when the HTTP response is returned from the web server or when the round trip is completed. Generally, the script will use a server-side language like PHP, Java, C#.NET, etc. for the server-side processing. This illustration captures the web server, the application server, and the database server all on separate servers. In reality, they could be running on a single server, 2 servers, or 3 servers as pictured. This picture is just showing us each of the individual functions on a separate server. JavaScript can be used in conjunction with either static or dynamic web pages. In this illustration, they are showing JavaScript using the same type of illustration as a static web page. Just like the static web page illustration, the web browser is making an HTTP request to the web server. This time, the page being returned as the HTTP response contains JavaScript, which is a client-side scripting language that is executed by the JavaScript engine in the browser. JavaScript allows more user interactivity with the web page through various effects, animation, etc. JavaScript can also be used to validate web page content to minimize the number of round trips to a server. jQuery is a JavaScript library that simplifies DOM manipulation and event handling. We will look at jQuery in Module 7 after getting familiar with the JavaScript basics. Besides jQuery, there are other, more sophisticated JavaScript frameworks that can be used, like React, Angular, and Vue.js. These frameworks provide developers with pre-built components and structures to accelerate application development. Unfortunately, these frameworks are a bit beyond the scope of this class, which is to teach an introduction to JavaScript. However, professional JavaScript developers will generally have skills in one of these frameworks. Let's go ahead and take a look at some common JavaScript type features on web pages. Let's start by looking at the Lands End website. On this web page, we'll see several different JavaScript related effects. Immediately, we'll see processing happening when we start adding search criteria. In some cases, we see that it appears to be making a partial page fetch to the server without refreshing the entire page content. Typically, that is done with AJAX, or asynchronous JavaScript and XML, which we'll be looking at in our last module of the semester. We also see JavaScript in action when we mouse over and mouse off an image. Also, depending on how the web page is processing images, most likely prefetching the images, JavaScript would be used to display the new images when the mouse over, mouse off events occur. If we navigate to another feature on the Lands End site and attempt to apply for a new account, we see a web form where we can enter a name, email address, and password. If we go ahead and hit the Create Account, we see that the page does not post back to the server and immediately changes out the coloring around the text boxes and provides messaging below the text fields. Simple validations and effects are done on web entry forms using JavaScript to ensure that a user enters the information before it performs the round trip to the server to process the new account creation in this particular instance. If we instead go to the Cascade Brewing site and go to the beers page and mouse over the beers, they have just a little bit of a bounce effect, which is achieved using JavaScript. If we go to the By the Dozen bakery site, the cake photos use a lightbox effect, which is accomplished using JavaScript and jQuery. Looking at Woodward's website, they use the standard carousel banner, which utilizes JavaScript. It automatically advances the images in the carousel, but you can access the previous or the next images. The last carousel implementation that we're going to look at is on the Best Buy's website, where they use it for a product carousel. They're using this more as a visual menu to drill into products. You can scroll similarly to what we saw with the Woodward's banner carousel, but can also directly drill into product information by clicking on the image. Now, hopefully this is going to get you thinking about how you can take your web pages that you've previously created to the next level with JavaScript. This semester, we'll be looking at all these capabilities using JavaScript and jQuery after we spend just a little bit of time building our skill set in the JavaScript scripting language itself.